Gather your...
You forgot.
So this poem actually is gonna take off nicely from that Fox News clip, weirdly. It's called Olive Picking on Election Day. Because the midterm elections happened while I was in Italy, and I was with a group of people who were unbelievably progressive thinking and deeply, deeply committed. So anyway, olive picking on election day. We were learning how to strip the olives, heavy as grapes and history, from silvery branches. The grower taught us 2 ways: grab a handful of branches and yank the hand rake through as if combing the hair of someone you hate. Or, using the long-handled rake, reach up high and then pull down through the leaves using the weight of your arms and your strong hips. Among our group was my mother and her friends, all of them over 80 and tired of cruelty and injustice. It started as a joke of catharsis, one of them cursing the name of a conservative politician who had burned the world and cheated the people, while she sublimated violence against the trees. But soon it was a chant, a riot. They were dancing in the trees, jerking their tools through the branches and shouting the names of the palm greasers they hated, men who had corrupted the nation, men who needed to go. I joined them. I was thrilled when I shouted out a name that made them all laugh and work even harder to pull it all down. The sound of the olives hitting the ground was like bones popping. And after, when we sat down to lunch, we poured oil on our plates like the blood of our enemies.
Okay, so I want to thank the Kahn Institute. I want to thank all of us, because I think we're a great group. And I think we cooperate all the time in many ways. If you found time to read anything I sent out, I thank you. And somebody even posted something about Israeli food yesterday.
That was me.
I wonder, I was looking last, I said, oh, I don't think I did that. I thought, okay, more cooperation. I think some of what I'm going to talk about, we had food and science, food and chemistry, and now we're food and culture, food and religion. I think some of what I'm going to say, to me, reminds me of something Suleiman said, some things that Sarah said when you asked the writing exercise you gave us about remembering a food and how our thinking or feelings might have changed over time. And also what we were talking about last week in your presentation, Amy, when we started talking about gender roles. So I'm sure there's many other connections, and I hope there are. So first things first, dessert, the honey cake. Elsa took up my invitation and came over, and there we were, very happy with the recipe. I'm going to talk about the recipe book in a minute. These are the raw cakes. So there's a material aspect to cooking as well as everything else. I mean, how do you have the recipe written, unless this is before the days of electronic recipes? There's the utensil. That's my favorite mixing bowl when I bake a cake. And Elsa seemed to like it pretty much too. And then I like this picture because it's both of us very happy and smiling. So maybe if I minimize this one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I don't really like a picture of me, but it's a sweet picture of both of us. So there you have it. So like the mother in your story, we offered the honey cake lovingly. Now, this is a quintessential Jewish holiday food. It has both sugar and honey in it. It's quite sweet. I'll tell you what kind of sugar and what kind of honey in a minute. But it's a way of fulfilling the mandate to offer greetings and blessings to other people. And one of the standard blessings is, may you be inscribed, meaning may God inscribe you. But in any case, may you have a good and sweet year. And that's the blessing, a good and sweet year. So this is a way of embodying it and enacting it. So when Elsa arrived, I said, I'm going to use the recipe as written in this notebook. I said, you think it's an old notebook? That was a very easy question. She said, yes, it's very old. I said, guess from when? So she was being kind, and she guessed the 1980s. I said, no. This notebook goes back to the year after I graduated from college, and I spent that year in Jerusalem. And that was 1974, 1975. Now the truth is I have printed up the recipe and I have it in a computer file, but I prefer making it from this notebook. I took this notebook with me before I went on this great adventure halfway around the world, and I wrote down 4 recipes, 4 things that my mother made that I thought I might want to make when I'm living on my own. And of these 4, there's 2 that I still make. There's a lemon cake and there's the honey cake. So, you know, like the stains on it, and also, it's like a diary from that whole year in Jerusalem. And the craziest thing, I saw somebody's name in there who's just offering an internship now in Boston to our daughter. I mean, it's wild. So the thing is, Suleiman asked, was this my mother's recipe? Of course it was my mother's recipe, but there are adaptations. And the way my sister makes it in Florida and the way I make it up here in Western Mass, these are not the same honey cakes. First of all, I have always preferred dark honey. So, you know, I love buckwheat honey. This was made from Summer Wildflower. It's local. What's his name? Connor, Dick, and Beth. Red Barn, I think they call it. Yeah, it's one of their honeys. I try not to eat white carbs. So there's no white sugar in it. It's Rapadura whole cane sugar. There's no white flour in it. It's whole wheat pastry flour. And I love ginger. So the spices, it's strong tea with cinnamon, ginger, and allspice. And, you know, my mother had stipulated a certain amount, and I know my sister doesn't really like ginger, so she puts in much less or leaves it out. I'm crazy about ginger, so I up the ginger. And anyway, there was one experiment this time. I don't know, those of you who bake or cook, you're never supposed to make excuses when you present something. You know, sometimes you have people come over and you don't feel it came out as well as you liked. But whenever I start saying that, my husband kind of says, be quiet, you know, it's not good. Just give the food, share it, and let people enjoy it. But what I have discovered, see, first of all, only for this group have I deigned to go out of my routine and make this cake in November. I only make it for the holiday with which it's associated. I only make it in, you know, it's roughly speaking September, the Jewish New Year. I've never made it before in November, so there's always a first.
Thank you.
But what I discovered, sometimes I make it the night before, and it hasn't come together yet. You know, it's one of those kinds of cakes you really need to let it sit. And it's always better a few days later. And with Elsa's expert guidance, we didn't overbake it. It all was right. So it's actually been sitting wrapped up since Tuesday night. So now I know that that's a good idea. Just let it sit for 2-3 days. Because I think
refrigerated or not?
Never refrigerated. Oh, because it really dries it out. Only if you're keeping it so long that you know that you need the benefits of refrigeration. But it does freeze very well. Anyway, I am inordinately proud of my honey cake, and I'm very happy to share it. To be honest. Okay.
So what fat does it have in it?
Excuse me?
What fat does it have?
Oil.
Corn oil?
I used to use corn oil. Now I think I use canola and possibly a touch of safflower because we ran out of the organic canola. I think the strong tea is one of the secret ingredients. And lemon juice. And I can post it if you're interested.
Of course I'm interested.
I'll be happy to post
Of course I'm interested.
it. Okay.
Anyone who has a recipe, it goes up on the recipe forum. Okay, that's just a rule. You're gonna get a D if you don't do that.
And there is a second one, and I thought we'd go through 2. So if anybody wants some more, just start the second one. Okay, it's here for us. I'm not trying to save it. Okay. All right. So my project is not really. It's a pedagogical project, though it gets me into a lot of research, but not my usual research. So you can pass this out now. This is not really the syllabus for the course. It's excerpts from the syllabus. to give you an idea. Starting in 2014, I've been teaching a course. It's the Intro to the Jewish Tradition, and it's also a religion course, so it has a dual prefix. It eventually settled at the 100 level. And the course is Intro to the Jewish Tradition or Intro to Jewish Civilization. And the theme is food and foodways. Now, a few of us who teach Jewish studies, we take turns with it, and the other instructors taught it completely differently. I can deliberate about things and make them very complicated. I had this idea about food and foodways in a flash. It just hit me. That's how I'm going to do it. That it would allow for a new kind of creativity for me. This is the fourth time, and I'm teaching it now this semester. It's ongoing, so it's an ongoing project. It's always developing, and I'm open to suggestions and ideas. So, why did I develop it? Well, I thought it would serve, I wanted to do something new. I thought it could serve as a good introduction to the Jewish tradition. I would say food is integral to any culture, and it's a very good way to study culture, but it's particularly good for one that places so much attention on food. I thought it was a good way to introduce Jewish studies as a field of study because my approach is interdisciplinary. It's a broad chronological sweep with a lot of different kinds of questions and issues and sources. So roughly speaking, I feel I'm addressing religion, culture, society, identity type questions, memory, migration, gender roles, ancient to contemporary. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give a very broad sweep of Jewish texts, culture, and practices, and experience, both collective and individual. Now, I was aware that food studies as a field has been burgeoning, and I'm talking about the humanities primarily, but in social sciences, but all of you know of it in so many other areas, which I had some dim awareness of. Also in the field of religion, it's become a hot topic the last 5-6 years or so. There's one article whose title I think is quite evocative. It's about scholarship on food, and it's called something like Bread from Heaven and Bread from Earth. So bread from heaven, in other words, the prescriptions or laws or instructions about food, and bread from the earth is the practice, right? It's the performance, it's the experience. How do these people really eat? What do they really do around the table? So I like that combination. And I have many interests in the study of religion and history. One of my interests with regard to religion is what's called the study of lived religion, religion as an embodied practice. What do people actually do, as opposed to just what do they think, or their metaphysical constructions of the world, how they practice. Okay. On a more personal note, I've now lived in this valley for a long time, since 1989. I've loved the farmers markets. I then learned about community-supported agriculture. So I had my own growing interest in local farms. In vegetarianism, I'm not a vegetarian, but I eat a lot more vegetarian than I used to. My own concerns with health, and cooking as a source of pleasure, of health, and also creativity. It partly had to do with the stage of life. Our kids were gone. Some things, my husband is a great cook, but he likes to eat some things that I don't like to eat, and I started developing my cooking with vegetarian soups, and he's always saying, this needs a chicken taste, and I'm saying, no, I don't think so. If we have friends who eat kosher, I want them to be able to eat the soup. If I have friends who eat only vegetarian, I want them to be able to eat the soup I've made. That's the way I'm making, except for chicken soup, that's the way I'm making soups from now on. And I had all these vegetables from the farm that I really had to learn what to do with them. I think there was something else. This was 2014. And my father died in 2011. And my mother died in 2013. They both lived to the very ripe old age of 92. But caring for them in their last years, when each suffered from a different kind of dementia, was, a serious task. And I think that my wanting to teach a course about food was in some way of connecting with my mother. And I think, it was, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I found this, that after my parents died, and particularly my mother, I could see the arc of her life. I could understand things about her that I didn't really see while she was still alive. So I think it was also a way of reconnecting. She was an excellent cook and baker in her younger years. She did leave the house for paid employment, but for a long time her identity was as a homemaker. And I think this was a way of reconnecting with my mother with something that she was really good at, that she took pride in, that we all benefited from. And it was before her dementia, so I could see her in all her glory, as it were. And there could have been deeper reasons for wanting to connect with my mother in that way. So I think it was all these things together that came into this course. So I handed out, this is an excerpted version of the syllabus. And you may be wondering, why on one topic did I put the readings in and for another I didn't? Because you're not interested in all the readings. It's just to show you, there's classical texts, there's literary works, there's YouTube videos, there's, philosophic, mystical explanations, there's tales of migration, there's, what else do I have? Contemporary adaptations that address sustainability and food and social justice. Through much of the course, obviously, I treat Jews as subjects, but there's one section on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism where I discuss Jews as objects of distrust, misunderstanding, and sometimes hatred, often focused on food practice, not solely on food practices, but that's the way we look at it. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Feel free to interrupt me at any time.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
I saw that you talked about bagels, and then later you sort of wrote about tradition and modernity and the modern Yiddish stuff. And I was wondering if you ever talk about bialys or I don't know. That's really important in my Jewish culture, and so I just wondered.
I don't really go into bialys because you see my not so hidden secret. I mean, how many people's courses were on page 3 on the bagels? How many people's courses would have a comparison of Montreal to New York bagels? Well, mine does because I'm from Montreal. And it's a way of looking at also sub-ethnicity. Students start the course. Everyone has most people have some kind of warm, positive, affectionate attitude towards food. Some people are Jewish and they think they know either a lot or a little, but they want to know more. A lot of students in the class are not Jewish. Either they have some interest in Jewish culture or they're interested in a course on food and culture. And I'm just very gratified when any student says she began to think about food and family and community and culture in a deeper way than she did before the course. So I don't concentrate on bialys. Obviously you would if you taught it.
Right.
But I make sure people get to taste Montreal bagels. And part of my planning is, which friend is going up so I can get a shipment of them fresh. And I had an auditor last year who had spent a lot of time in the food business. And he taught me how to warm them up best for the class, given that, they're not fresh out of they haven't come from the 24-hour wood baking oven in Montreal. So that's part of what's fun because, I'm always learning something something that somebody contributes, whether it's from their experience or they find something on, online or. Yeah. So sorry, I don't have much to add about
I was
bialys.
just curious.
And it's.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
Lois. How do you approach anti-Semitism using food as a way in?
Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get to the story, the malicious matzah.
Okay.
But I would say this, in general, we just had this class this week, actually. There's an interesting article about garlic, particularly in early modern Europe, in Germany. At one point, garlic was, this only makes sense in Germany. Obviously, you would never have distrusting people because of garlic
No, but that was
in the southern Mediterranean and the Middle East because it's such a widespread foodstuff, right? But, I mean, one of the points of the course is, you know, Jews live throughout the world and there's so much geographic disparity and cooking styles are very different. So at the beginning, I asked students, you know, what do you think of as a Jewish food? And, you know, it's interesting to hear what people say. You know, they're mostly based on, you know, bagels, smoked salmon.
Ashkenazi food.
Right, it's Ashkenazi food, right? But 1 minute, your question. So the garlic, at a certain point, like somebody made fun of the writer Heine by calling him like a garlic head. And then a lot of things went along with that. Now, I don't know if it's true. I can't really believe that Jews in those areas ate garlic more than anybody else. And earlier associations of garlic as being healthy and maybe an aphrodisiac, that had, like, those are kind of medieval associations. But the most important thing is blood. I'm going to talk in a minute about what makes meat kosher, which means ritually fit, and it does have to do with it not having blood. And give me a minute to get to that, but the whole issue of blood, the other thing is the blood. So Jewish meat is not rare. If it's cooked according to kosher laws, you don't eat it very rare. But starting in 12th century England, there's something called the blood libel. This is a charge that was linked fundamentally to Christian notions of the host and not desecrating the host, the Eucharistic host. And this terrible idea arose that Jews needed, and you know, I hate to say it out loud, but you asked me, so the Jews, there's the charge that Jews used the blood of Christian children as an essential ingredient in matzah, which is the unleavened bread eaten at Passover for 8 days. Needless to say, the only ingredients in matzah are water and flour, and no more than 18 minutes of cooking. There's no... So it's a very strange, inverted charge, and it's not only in the Middle Ages, because there was a revival of blood libel charges in Central and Eastern Europe from the late 19th century. You might have heard of the Bayless Affair, 1911, 1913. We read an editorial in the New York Times yesterday in a source book about it. So unfortunately, this is a very long charge, and I put that under the category of distrust of Jewish, you know, food practices. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also a distrust of Jewish food, and you know, because of the arc of the Muslim world that traveled, you know, from the Middle East across North Africa to southern Spain, and Jews ate a lot of those foods, as everyone else in Iberia did too, and then they became associated with them, and one of those was garlic, another was eggplant, and those were then considered Jewish foods, and people avoided them so they wouldn't be considered Jewish. So that's another aspect.
I'd love you to show me more of that, because I
Yeah.
know about that a little bit less.
So people didn't want to be, because it was so dangerous to be considered a Jew in so many places.
Well, particularly Iberia.
Yeah,
after
particularly
the
Iberia.
Inquisition.
But I mean, they did not have the first Inquisition, just saying. But Jewish food practices were a way in which people found out who was a Jew. You know, did she cook on the Sabbath? Did she eat pork? Did she hide her cooking pot in the ashes so she would be able to bring it out warm on Saturday? Like those kinds of... And what did she put in there? Did she put garlic? Did she put eggplant? Oh, Jews put eggplants in their long pot, in their long cooking pot.
And what oil?
And
what
oh,
fat?
exactly. And so I'm not going to eat an eggplant because I don't want people to think that I'm Jewish.
So you heard that, or you read that, or you
I
saw
read
it in
that.
stories?
A Drizzle of Honey is one of the books that has that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk. We could talk. Yeah.
Yeah. So
There's a lot
the
of
other thing
jargon
is
going on in there.
what?
There's a lot of jargon and a lot of
So
kind of esoteric references.
okay. So you know what? Let
Just,
me.
like, so we have that in-
I wanted to lay something out. Actually, I want to say what the dietary laws are, what makes food kosher and not, and then maybe you'll understand these comments more. So, do you want to hold your question or you want
No,
it
no.
now?
I was just gonna say that about a month ago in the New York Times they posted a video of white supremacists drinking milk, and it went to your point about people having lactose intolerance. But you were saying about how food and anti-Semitism like that. There's also the whole thing about what you ingest, and anyway.
Well,
So they were drinking milk as a protest of, or a proclamation.
The question
their
of what did-
whiteness.
sorry. I mean, some of these questions run very deep when you get to food and culture and social groups and social identity. What you eat, what you don't eat, who you eat with, who you don't eat with. And it goes beyond that. I mean, one article we read, which the title always gets a laugh. It's about Jews and ancient Romans, and it's called something like "From Their Bread to Their Bed." So, it's the drawing of boundaries between groups in all kinds of ways and mixing. Okay, so let me go back in order so that nobody's feeling too lost. Where was I? Okay, and we also look at things in terms of, humor and affection. And it's funny, I teach it's a serious course, it's an analytical course, but it's also a lot of fun. Now, why can't I get these three? I want to get to the 100 Jewish foods, I think it's this one. I really don't want to waste time.
Tablet magazine, just go to tablet.
Where is it?
I don't know.
You're right, that's what it is. I'm looking for the
Let's
tablet.
escape from,
Yeah.
Go
Here.
to one of the Chromes. Pick up one of the Chrome ones.
This is why. Okay.
But it's up on the side. Yeah,
That's
there you
it, that's it, thank you. So I showed this the first day, and actually it was Liz, thank you, it was Liz Claridge in anthropology who said, do you know about this? A couple of months ago. So Tablet Magazine is a Jewish magazine online, 100 most Jewish foods. Spin the table and click on dishes to discover more. It's just fun. So somebody tell me which one you want me to click on if you identify anything.
Is that brisket?
I don't know, you know what, you said bialy, so we'll go with the bagel.
Can't you see?
Okay, so there's some information, right?
it's at least Jewish food.
Well, if you read the whole book on the bagel, you'll see what all its origins. Why can't? Okay. Okay, and then it gives a history and. Oh, I see.
What?
Bazooka gum.
Bazooka.
I know, I literally
Really?
craving.
Anyway, so we have a little bit of we have a little bit of fun with this, okay? That was just to show you. I can just pass this around if you like.
Okay.
So do you think it's good? I mean, did you look at the app and the site?
Do I think it's good? I just think I think it's fun. It gives them some ideas, depending on what else we've done in the introductory discussion. It depends how much time we have to play with it.
Okay.
I don't have a terribly precise pedagogical goal with this, to be honest. We also build a collective bibliography in the course of the semester, where basically I have students find sites, websites, or blogs on Jewish food, and I ask them to post it and to say, do they think it's valuable, do they think it's worthwhile, what makes it good, what doesn't. And sometimes somebody can't find a whole site, but they find an article on NPR, what Amy posted last night or something like that. If necessary, we accept that too as a one-time article. Now, Tom asked me to address this when I was telling him what I was planning to do. He said, what would you say about the students and their experience of the course? So I've already told you a little bit. It was a student who gave me a very important idea, which maybe was obvious to you, Nancy, but the whole hands-on experience. The first time I put the course together, I'm thinking, what should they read, and how do I touch all the bases, and what do I assign, what do I not assign, it's too much. And one student said, okay, we're going to spend a week on the Passover Seder. And I always taught it in the spring until this year, and the timing changes a few things. And she said, I know there's so many different kinds of haroset. Now, haroset is a food, it's a paste, it's symbolic at Passover, and in the Ashkenazic, the Northern European world, and most American Jews are descended from Ashkenazic Jews, apples, wine or grape juice, raisins, something like that, walnuts. But Jews from the Middle East and North Africa and other areas, no walnuts, no apples. There are many date-based mixtures and others. So I have the students do research, and each group has to come up with a different recipe. And then we bring them in and we taste them. So that's always been a nice project. And that little hands-on, that was like a tiny snippet, has grown through the years. Last year, Nancy was kind enough to host it was a small class last year, and
I was on sabbatical.
Yes, she was on sabbatical.
So I had a little more time.
And you had an assistant. And we
Yes.
had a wonderful session at her house called the Sephardic Table. I'm sure we'll hear more about some aspects of that in your presentation. And then after that, one of the, I had a Chinese American, not Jewish student in the class, and she said to me, "Can you teach us how to make potato latkes?" So potato latkes are the pancakes associated with Hanukkah. And you're supposed to eat something that's fried because it commemorates the story of the oil in the temple lasting 8 days after a period of persecution by the Persians, etc., etc. And you remember that miracle that the oil lasted 8 days in the temple, Jerusalem. So I said, well, I only make them in December. I never make them at any other time of year. And she said, please. I said, okay, all right, well, come to my house. We made them in April. And we tried to experiment. And I had my mother's traditional recipe, and then we said, let's try sweet potatoes. Well, guess what? Sweet potatoes are horrible, because I don't have a good recipe yet. For the quantities, you can't just substitute sweet potato for potato, as the chemists and the farmers among you know. Didn't work. So anyway, then I laughed, and I thought of my mother, and I said, I could just see my mother saying, for this you have to get a Harvard PhD so you could teach them how to make my potato pancakes. And it was a great time. We had a wonderful time. So I'm open to student suggestions. This year we're having two big workshops, and Nancy's going to participate in one of them again, I think. Okay, so I'm glad they brought that to the course. So let me explain something very briefly. The central fact about Jewish foodways is that there are biblical laws that outline 4 basic things. Now, Jewish traditional teaching is God, Moses, Mount Sinai, divine instruction, and that the do's and the don'ts in what you might call the Torah, the Bible, Scripture, that those are divine mandates, right? Now, the dietary laws are found in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They're framed with a somewhat enigmatic statement. It has something to do with holiness. Now, don't ask me to explain what holiness means. That is not my job to explain it. But it's a most evocative word in religious and spiritual discourse, yes? Okay. So there's 4 principles. Some foods are permitted to be eaten to the ancient Israelites and their descendants, and some foods are prohibited. And in each classification of, animals in the sea and animals on the earth and those that fly in the sky, there's some that are permitted and some that are prohibited. The ones that are most well known that are prohibited are no flesh of the pig and no shellfish. Okay? And those have been particularly, even going back to Roman times, the whole question of pig became a very culturally weighted, symbolic thing. Like who ate, Jews didn't eat it, what they called themselves, what they thought of the Romans who did, and then later, it was a term of derision once it became illegal to be a Jew outwardly in Spain. Those Jews who were Catholic on the outside, but kept up some secret Jewish practices, such as not eating pig, or cooking, say, with olive oil rather than with lard, and other things. The term of derision for them was moranos, or morana, which means pig. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, the pig is the most symbolic.
So why is it forbidden?
Because the Torah says it is forbidden.
But why?
It has something to do with holiness. Excuse me, I am not the divine author, I guess. I'm not even the human component compiler who put it together. And there's many, many theories. I mean, anthropologists have all kinds of theories about it. That there are these binary categories and having to do with the symbolic ordering of the universe.
It wasn't because of trichinosis.
Yes.
Well, some of
See,
listen.
there's always a
No.
reason
I'm glad
somewhere.
you've raised that
No,
because
I think
there's a
that
lot
there
of
was.
explanations. I mean, there's a lot of a lot of Jewish literature tries to explain biblical laws, and then the phase of rabbinic Judaism, early centuries of this era, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and all kinds of other literature. And inquiring minds want to know what was the divine purpose in all of this. And one school of thought is that it's all related to health. Right? That there's something about eating this way. You're not eating the bottom feeders in the ocean. But that kind of answer depends on the state of medical and scientific knowledge at a given time, right? You have to know about refrigeration or methods of preserving to say, well, pork doesn't last as well in a hot Middle Eastern climate as some other meats. Some people looked at herding and grazing practices in the mountains of Canaan and the lowlands and how much resources you need to feed chickens and what did you need for pigs and how common were pigs. But I love the comment of a certain 16th century scholar who said, you know, these explanations about health and science, they're all very good, but I haven't noticed that Jews are healthy and non-Jews are not healthy based on what they eat. But explanations come and go. You know, at certain times there's very, and I go into this a little bit on the syllabus. We look at, you know, explanations of the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides from the 12th century. We look at mystical explanations. Oh, Susie is fascinated by the Kabbalah. Mystical explanations. They have a different take on holiness. They don't think it has anything to, if you told them it had to do with health or hygiene, they'd say that's a lower order of thinking, you know. So, one thing, one effect, is clearly group identity. The social function. Okay, so I think we're only at the, you said why. Okay, so 4 principles. Kosher means fit or proper. That's what the word means, and kashrut, which you sometimes might see, is the abstract noun for the whole system. It doesn't mean clean, it doesn't mean healthy, it doesn't mean good, it just means ritually fit. Okay, so there's permitted foods and prohibited foods. 3 times it says, don't boil or seethe or cook a kid, we're back to the goats, in its mother's milk. In its mother's milk. It took several hundred years before this developed into a widespread separation of don't eat dairy with meat. No cheeseburgers. And you can imagine all the other things. There's some very interesting rabbinic discussions as to what do you do with chicken. A chicken isn't a mammal. Do we have to worry about the mother's milk with the chicken? And most of the rabbis said, we're going to include chicken as meat for this purpose, just so people don't get confused. And one rabbi, in his view, his dissident opinion is still there in the Talmud, saying, in our village up in the northern Galilee, we do eat chicken with milk, and we don't think it's a problem, and I'm going to continue doing that. But that was very much a minority opinion. But when we look at this, it's also showing students something about how Jewish sacred literature works, and that's part of my goal too, for them to see all these different genres.
In relationship to group identity, etc., in the Middle East there is a dish that is very much cooked to tease the Jews. It's called in its mother's milk.
Oh, really?
And the best meat to use is obviously goat. And that's another thing of
yeah. Well, there's a lot of taunting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But you also saw, if you had time to read the introductions, and I didn't presume you read everything, but you know, there are many different styles of Jewish food. Jewish food is characteristic of its region, but it has a twist of its own. So maybe, you know, it will be, for some reason we'll use beef instead of lamb, though both are kosher. Or, you know, olive oil instead of some other fat, and so on. Okay, the other 2 provisions of kosher of the kosher laws are an animal must be ritually slaughtered. You cannot just take any old dead animal and eat it. It has to be killed in a certain way. It has to be healthy, and then it has to be inspected that it was healthy. And I don't want to get into too many details about this. Some people look at the Bible and they see before Noah and before the flood, the instructions were, you may eat of everything growing from the earth. So there are vegetarians, Jewish vegetarians, who say, you know, if you really read the Bible carefully, you'll see that we're not really meant to eat meat. That was a concession for some reason after the flood. But another, I would say that's a minority opinion, but it's, you know, it's certainly, you can find it among some people. The idea of ritual slaughter, there's a lot of explanation about this. It's basically, it's a very quick method, and it's not industrial slaughter. It's like one person, one knife, one animal. And there's a lot that's been written. Some people, there's a lot that's been written about that maybe this is some, that, you know what, I'm going to hold this comment. Wait 1 minute, because that's not what I really want to devote my energy to now. So let me move on to the next one, and then I'll make the general point. And the other thing is, you don't eat the blood of a ritually slaughtered animal. You drain it. You drain the blood. And there the reason given is there's some idea that the blood is the life. The blood is the life force. So when you put that together, either you say why. Well, it depends what register you're asking that in, right? If you think this is divine law, you're going to answer one way. If you're thinking this is a very interesting set of foodways, and you're wondering what can it mean, the students now usually come up with words that sometimes echo texts that I know from all different centuries. And other times they just use a word from today. They say, well, there's a kind of, maybe there's a sensitivity to the animal that you don't want to, they go back to literally not cooking a kid in its mother's milk, right? That would be very, maybe the animal has feelings, like humans, that would be cruel, right? And then some writers have said, they've expanded of like what you eat may determine your moral qualities. So some would say, you know, some people would say for that reason it's better to eat vegetables. Some would say, well, you can eat animals, but only if you do it with a certain mindfulness. If you do it with a certain consciousness, that if you are going to take the life of an animal in order to eat it, you should have some kind of ceremony around it. You should have some kind of acknowledgement that you've actually taken the life of a living being, and that by obeying the prescriptions about ritual slaughter, you are slowing down, you are recognizing that. You know, and then, so, you know, one can explain this in all kinds of different ways, right? All right. So, some people, so now fast forward through the generations. Today. So some Jews obey the dietary laws, they observe them carefully. Some rebel against them, and some are obviously completely indifferent and or ignorant about them. So some people adhere to them because of religious conviction, some out of family practice, some out of a kind of nostalgia, some out of communal identity and solidarity, saying, you know, this is the way my ancestors ate, this is the way my grandparents ate. I don't really think it has anything divine to it, but, you know, I'm not going to go against this. And for some people, it's a kind of, you know, we've talked about migration a fair bit. It's a kind of ethnic cuisine, right? So, personally, my kitchen isn't kosher. There's some non-kosher thing, and at different times I've decided I would observe some prohibitions and some not, right? I used to eat ham, now I don't, but if I go to Italy, that's when I make the exception. I will have one really good portion of sandarielle, prosciutto. But only there, only in Italy. Would I ever have a glass, and I don't eat shellfish because my mother was allergic to it, so I never developed that taste. Could I have a glass of milk with a meat meal? No. I mean, I used to eat cheeseburgers, but it's not out of religious conviction, it's just, to me, you don't do it, right? And that gets us to another layer, which we're going to get to in a minute, which is family and practice, and just what do we do and what do we grow up with. So the one other thing I wanted to say, and then we can turn to, I hope you had a chance to read a couple of more interesting pieces. The other key aspects of Jewish food in Jewish religion and culture, the home table is sacred. The home table, having a meal around the table, becomes a substitute for the 2 temples in Jerusalem that were destroyed in 586 before the Common Era and in the year 70 of this era. So that ancient form of worship, right, of the priests offering a sacrifice on the altar to earn divine favor, can't do it anymore. The home table, with certain practices and a certain kind of attitude, we might say mindfulness, consciousness, and the saying expressions of gratitude to the divine for food, that is explicitly said to be a small sanctuary and a substitute for the temple. I mean, it was a brilliant invention, really, because everybody has to eat every day, right? And if you invest the eating around a table together with sanctity, think of all the dimensions of life you're tying together, right? So that's one thing. And one of the sources you might have looked at towards the end in the Talmud, which is compiled between the 2nd and 6th century. It says, so how is the home a substitute? How is the home table? And it says it makes atonement. That's one of those big words, like what is atonement? And then the explanation is given by extending hospitality. So again, some very basic aspects of daily, our lives as animals and as social beings and in families are all tied together with this aura of sanctity. Okay. The other thing is there's Jewish cooking, there's requirements for the Sabbath. If you're an observant Jew, there's many kinds of work. You're supposed to abstain from work on the 7th day in memory of the biblical story. God abstained from work after creating the world in 6 days. There's a whole list of categories of work you're not supposed to do. One of them is lighting a fire. So you're not supposed to start cooking a dish on the Sabbath, hence many slow cooking stews that you put in a pot. You put the chili beans, whatever it is, you put it there on Friday afternoon before sunset. It just keeps cooking and cooking at a very low temperature. And it's all the better how many hours later, right? So that's one thing. Passover, you're not supposed to eat leavened bread, and some other things connected to that, which is why, I make a great Sephardic means Jews who originally came from Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. And there's a very famous cookbook writer today, Claudia Rodin, who lives in London, and she's done a lot to publicize in a high cultural kind of way Sephardic recipes. And she has a fantastic orange cake, Sephardic orange cake for Passover. It doesn't use any wheat flour. The flour comes from ground almonds. So ground almonds, oranges boiled for 2 hours, and some other very, very good things. Wonderful cake. Okay. All right, I talked about that. Okay, so the pieces that I thought we might enjoy discussing is the one that focuses on women's roles, the one about memory, affection, and nostalgia in the gefilte fish, by Oliver Sacks. And I have a really funny 3-minute video if we talk about that one. And then some kind of humor. And the 2 moments of real humor, in terms of what I do in the course, are this story by the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem. Did any of you read The Malicious Matzah?
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's also something, at the University of Chicago, just after World War II, they started a debate called the Latke-Hummentosh debate. Those are 2 foods that are not mandated. They don't have great symbolic significance, but they have some significance with 2 different Jewish holidays. One is the Hanukkah winter holiday, and the other is Purim in the spring. And there's been this debate where people are in their academic robes, and they have to debate which one of these 2 well-beloved foods is better, and they have to do it according to their academic discipline. So the Jane Austen one called it something like latkes and I can't L. Anyway, that's very fun. If we have time, we'll look at that too. So why don't we, because we talked about women's roles last time, why don't we start with that one? So I think that was item
4, I think.
4. You see, because I think, and if you had time and if you read the introduction in item 3, a lot of feminists have not wanted to think of women in their traditional roles, for example, in the kitchen, right? And have thought, if you impose that on women today, that's drudgery. It's enforced drudgery. And I think I see in myself and I see in our students, if we're really interested, for example, in Jewish women's history, we have to come up with a way of understanding the generations who came before us and not just looking down on them as if they had false consciousness because all they did was cook and bake and they didn't have paid labor outside the house. Like, it's completely anachronistic to look down on them for such a reason. But it doesn't mean that, so how do we value women's role in the kitchen? And there's some scholars recently who have come up with new ways of writing about this and saying this is where women were experts. They were the ritual experts, and especially in a kitchen and at a table where everything was imbued with this aura of sanctity, that they played a very important role in transmitting the tradition on this visceral family way. And we should recognize they had some kind of, this author used the words control, definitely control in the kitchen. Though if they had a question if something was kosher, like let's say a piece of cheese fell into the meat stock and they didn't know if that was too much mixing, they'd have to go to a rabbi to get the answer, right? So the woman didn't have ultimate control, but still a lot of control. And I think authority that came with producing the food. So I think this is a good question, and then we look at feminist satyrs, people like Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug and some other very famous second wave feminists who started feminist satyrs in New York in the mid-1970s. And the idea was, we're not just going to be in the kitchen, we're going to be the ones conducting the ritual, leading the discussions. We'll come up with new interpretations of what's slavery, what's freedom, and so on. Okay, we understand that. But what about finding meaning in cooking and baking and producing food and sharing it with your community and with your family? So I really like this piece, Holiness in the Kitchen, by Chava Weissler. She is very much a feminist scholar. And I found this interesting for her being able to take a very simple prayer from a few hundred years ago and linking it to her own practice when she goes home from her university on Friday and bakes bread, breaks the Sabbath loaf every Friday. And she's not really I just find this charming. She's not really asking for an angel to come bless her baking. But the way she evokes the uncertainty, and it's true, every time you make something, you never know if it's going to come out right. Yeah? Like especially with baking, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you know why something worked, and other times you don't know why it didn't work. Isn't that all our experience? Yeah. So she evokes that, and I don't know, did this piece speak to anybody besides me?
Oh, yeah, totally. I actually really enjoyed the way she talks about yeast in the beginning, and I started putting line breaks in it and thinking of it as a poem. Like the opening paragraph of this is really lovely, and really respectful for the living organism that makes our food, right? That makes the bread.
When I reread it last night, I thought of you, Mona. That you would understand it all exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's a question that transcends food, but I think it's a very important question when we look at ourselves and we look at women's roles in the past and in the present and who we want to be. And it's not that we want to be our foremothers, but I just like this. Can we too sense the holiness of our mundane kitchen chores and our connection to our forebears? And can we turn wholeheartedly in the midst of the hurry to praise God, or whatever you can substitute for that, for the daily miracles of cooking, eating, and family gatherings.
I wanted to comment on that. I don't know how coherent I can be about this, but it feels to me like consent is everything, but if, if I can transcribe that or bring that over from another place, the idea that women's power can be in the kitchen, yes, absolutely, we should celebrate women who have found power there and have found a way to be conveyors of cultural knowledge through their cooking and through the control that they feel in the kitchen. But not all women feel that way. And the problem is if the only place where you're allowed to have that kind of power and autonomy is in the kitchen.
Of course, yeah. I mean, we want to.
Well, and also, it bugs me that you would have to go to the rabbi to find out about the cheese.
Well, if you don't know, listen, if you don't know the laws and you don't know what proportion, right? And I'm not going to get into the technicalities of a 60th versus something else. If you think you're living according to a divine law, you want to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get it wrong.
But as long as we're talking about gender, it means, okay, you have a
There's
certain
that-
amount of power here,
Well,
but
yes, for
just
many.
up to this point, and at that point, you're gonna have to go to a man.
If-
Well, now they're.
No,
There's
yeah, but we're talking,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
okay.
But,
Yes, I mean.
just like now there are female rabbis, but not primarily for people who are the groups that are now following kosher law down to the T. There aren't yet.
You know, but there's also the social dynamics and power. There are social dynamics and power, and there's, rabbis who were considered to be very compassionate leaders, say, of poor communities, who they prided themselves of always trying to allow whatever they could, and saying, oh, this doesn't meet the threshold of something that's forbidden, just rinse it and use it. I mean, like coming, in that kind of legal religious tradition, there's a lot of flexibility. Not complete flexibility, there's still rules, but it's not so cut and dry. That's why, you have experts who come up with different rulings. Did you want to say something, Lauren?
Yeah, it was separate from the divine law. It was more of a reflection on this mini piece of there's a hashtag bad feminism that sometimes women use to say or bad feminist, and I still like indulging in this tradition that oppresses women, but I like it, and hashtag I'm a bad feminist. And it's usually done in a comedic way, but sometimes I feel that because when I picture myself as the most successful version of myself in the future, I just am cooking. And I want to be rich and famous to the extent that I am successful enough that I can then spend all my time cooking. And it sort of just feels like I'm going backwards in time in a bit. But I guess the difference is that I have the choice to.
If you choose that's how you want to be creative and giving, that's different.
Makes me think about that in a nice way.
See, the other thing is, Suleiman shared his passion for cooking with us, right? So you chose that. You learned from your mother and you chose. In my family, the gender dynamics are a little bit mixed up because my husband is really a much better cook than I am. I cooked for the kids because he also worked out of town. So, I did make things that were fine. But everybody knew, no, I'm serious.
We'll have to bring him in.
But they knew the gourmet food was made by my husband, and he would spend hours. So he chose that, very similar to you in a lot of ways, actually. But it's interesting that at a certain point, I'm not trying to turn this all autobiographical, but I then realized that this was an area where I could be creative too. And I laugh sometimes. I think it's as if I'm doing PhD research. I pull down my cookbooks from the shelf and I say, oh, how do they make it here and how do they make it here? And I put together this recipe with that one and I mix and match. And then what I produce is.
But this has to do with also what we talked about last week with the Peruvian chefs. And the idea that when a man does it, then it's a profession, and when a woman does it, it's not worthwhile. And so I think it's really important for us to consider that if you get pleasure and creativity, and it is research, and there's a lot of knowledge from doing that activity, then why should it be that only the male gender gets to consider this a profession. And for a woman, if you do it, it's drudgery. You know, I think that we need to reinvent what some of these categories are. It is drudgery to produce 3 meals a day for a family, no matter whether you're the male cook or the female cook. It is. It's drudgery. And because most kids are like the ones, I don't like that, I want white food. and so I just think that one of the things that we're doing in this room is we're trying to reinvent what it means to be passionate about food and passionate about the planet and passionate about what we eat and why we eat it and what the cultural and symbolic, you haven't used that word yet, but I know that it's around everything you're saying,
Thank you.
and what the symbolic meaning is for what we're doing. And so I just, want to applaud you in what you're doing and say, allow yourself to feel that the fact that you've made that choice. And I assure you that Otolenge is not, turning over in his sleep. Well, people can consider me a woman because I'm a cook? No, I mean, no.
No, he's a
Well,
vampire, so.
But also, I mean, it's the broader question. I've heard this in other con groups and in other contexts. I think we have to struggle a little bit to learn the value of saying, how do we nurture ourselves and how do we nurture people around us? And this isn't something that necessarily has a dollar sign. It isn't always paid labor, right? But it's really very, very fundamental in so many ways. And I think that's what we're touching on. So I'm going to move on for a second because we only have about 7 minutes. And I think the filter, the Oliver Sacks piece is lovely. And I think we probably all can understand it without too much explanation. And the life course and memory and because I want to say something about the malicious matzah.
Yeah, just quickly though, because it dovetails with what you were talking about with the previous piece. It's a beautiful piece, the gefilte fish piece, but I got to the end of it and said, why didn't he make his own? Like, why not find the
Well, he
recipe?
was busy enlightening the world about neurology and other things.
But it did seem gendered, like he loved it so much, but he had to wait to find a woman to make it for him.
But he
Was that
also
gener- was that
appreciated those
generational?
women.
Yeah, I assume so.
Well, his mother and his housekeeper, he loved those women.
Yeah.
No, I have to say, you can be a woman who can't cook and you can be a man who can't cook.
And it's interesting, he names these great food, he says, but the bottle jar is terrible, like he would say. If we have time, or if you have time, look up the gefilte fish video that I wrote at the bottom. It's 3 generations of women. It's at the 11-minute, it's only 15 minutes, the 11-minute mark is hysterical. But as an old grandmother, she always made everything from scratch. The middle-aged woman, she uses a Cuisinart for the fish, she takes some other shortcuts. The younger one looks like she's in college or graduate school. She says no. It's not worth making, and it does stink when you grind up the fish. She says, she proudly holds up the Manischewitz jar and says, it's perfectly good, and I decorate it with carrots and lettuce, and nobody knows the difference. And you want to scream at her, of course everybody knows the difference. If this is a food you like, it tastes terrible from the jar. At the 11-minute mark, and she says, my lifestyle, it's not convenient. At the 11-minute mark, she says, but I think at some point when my mother is no longer around, I probably will assume the mantle of responsibility, and I too will start making it from scratch. And you probably fall off your chair at that point. And she says, it's not that it's better. She says, it's just tradition, I guess. So there's a lot in there. Now, I just want to say 2 words about the malicious matzah. How many of you read it? Okay, so, Shalom Aleichem is one of the great writers of modern secular Yiddish literature. And the Fiddler on the Roof comes from a set of his stories. So this story, it's almost like magical realism. It's a literary satire with resistance in it. It has the biblical framework, right? The book of Exodus, Pharaoh, the wicked king, oppressing the Jews. The historical realia is the Tsar in Russia and restrictive laws of the 1880s and 1890s, expelling Jews from Moscow, other big cities, quotas in universities, and other things. So the other point that's reflected in the story is that how many of you have eaten matzah? Okay, so some of you haven't. So those of you who haven't may not know, it becomes a little bit heavy in the stomach. And eating it for 8 days, well, you have to eat a lot of fresh fruit. There's a reason that, there's a lot of, it's really heavy. It's constipating. It's not delicious by 8 days, you have to become creative. And the best thing is just keep eating a lot of fruits and vegetables.
There's always a lot left at Big Y
Yeah,
or something.
yeah.
After.
Unless you buy it from
Not
Hungry
half,
Ghost,
right.
and then everybody at your table will love it. They make
Well, when it's
fabulous-
first fresh, it's
Yeah.
good, but I'm just saying that 8 days, it gets to be a bit much in the stomach. So he doesn't put that in the story, but anybody reading the story knows that. So the idea that this Jew who is going to negotiate with the ruler and the minister, right, to try to avert an evil decree and get it softened, and that, by the way, was a job in Eastern Europe. This kind of intercessor, negotiator figure was often appointed by the community. But the idea that this becomes a piece of matzah inside our stomach, and that this little figure is agitating. We're back to how do you digest, right? And then, poof. This is why I say magical realist, though I'm using the word very loosely, and I shouldn't with a scholar of literature sitting here. But then comes out of the finger after he gets what he wants. I just think it's a riot, that story.
That was bizarre though.
Why? I didn't
Why
know.
the tip of his
Oh,
left finger, there's probably some symbolic.
There probably is, I didn't pay attention to that. And he any other thoughts about this story?
As opposed to the tip of his middle finger.
So that's just a sampling. Here, if I can, I'll put this on as we're packing up. Yeah. So I just hit it?
Yeah.
Once or twice? Again. I don't use a Mac. This one. Have this one. Yeah. Oh, well, no, I didn't want that one.
Oh,
Yeah, this one.
Get blown out.
well, I think Aaron.
Okay.
2 hours.
Yeah, we're gonna be here till 6 o'clock.
Even the first 2 minutes will.
Do we have the sound on?
Annual vodka debate.
We're not getting the sound. They're playing pomp and circumstance. Can you hear it?
I don't know to turn your sound on. Okay, it's full. Wow.
You can hear.
You might have to make that one louder. We have to.
All right. Anyway, you get the idea.
What is it about?
This is the debate as to which well-beloved food that's symbolic of each of these holidays is better. The triangular pastry associated with the springtime holiday of Purim, or the fried potato like this with Hanukkah in December. Which one is better?
It's a 2-hour debate.
68.
This is the 68th annual debate at the University of Chicago. There's a whole book on it. And it's replicated. I mean, sometimes it's been done here in the 5 colleges.
Yeah, we have.
I think we need to
Yeah.
wrap
We're
up
done.
though.
It's 3:15.
Okay, excellent. So, just one quick announcement for the first meeting of the new semester, in case, unless anybody objects, we will be going to the brewery in downtown Northampton, get a tour of the brewery. Mona has so kindly, he wrote back to me, yes, has so
I was a
kindly,
little worried.
offered to make that connection, and so we're gonna have a wine and beer tasting and stay for dinner. And that's our first meeting of the new semester in January. Okay?
Second one
Which
is
is
where?
Which is not on Fridays, right?
Yeah, it's on Tuesday, it's on Tuesday
Tuesdays.
from 5 to 8.
Uh-huh.
Our spring meeting time.
Can I just add one more thing? I'm sorry, I left out something that was relevant to so many of you. Look at the last excerpt and you'll see something from an organization that's really involved with sustainability from a Jewish perspective and blending ritual and ethical perspectives with a current food justice and sustainability consciousness, that group called Chazon, which means vision.
And the other thing is that I will be sending out an email, or probably sending out an email about the details about our New York trip, so everybody will have them. But do check back on the Moodle page, we'll try and keep things very up to date there. Okay? Have a great weekend.
Thanks for your attention, and any comments
Thank you.
ongoing, I welcome them.
Thank you, very interesting.
Very interesting indeed.
It was a lovely lunch. Thank you for organizing.
Yeah.
I'm glad at a certain point Nancy stepped in.
I was happy to let her decide.
It was great, thank you.
Oh, and thank you.
So you got that from Table and Wine?
I got that from Liquor 44. That you can come take. Liquor 44 is the cheapest.
Okay.
Lois, since you gave the talk, would you like to finish? No? Okay, you don't have to. I'm not gonna force you.